So an issue that seems as though it lies on solely one side um, of the ideological divide with reference to atheism, but I think it need not, is the issue of abortion. And I think up until I really actually started considering what the details look like on the ground, rather than just thinking about it in some conceptual space where should women have this choice or not. There's a framing issue there, of course, and I'll talk about that. But I think the issue of abortion, it seems as though if you're a conservative atheist, you're already in the extreme minority camp. But especially if you're a conservative atheist who is in some way sympathetic to the pro-life side, it probably feels as though you're a non-existent minority, just like it feels for me. It may turn out that there's 10 of us who feel the same way I do about it. But I think the primary issue that I see in this space is that it's framed on both sides with their own sort of conceptual spin on it. But I think both sides, as it were, would agree that there are only two positions here, and if you don't hold one, you hold the other, and vice versa. And it's a sort of zero-sum game between the two sides. I've heard it claimed by pretty much everybody that I can think of on either side of the issue over the past couple of years as there having ever been and is not now any space for a moderate point of view, or a not yes, not no, but maybe, or I haven't yet been convinced, just some sort of gray area. It seems as though most people are convinced that doesn't exist. I don't agree with that, and I sit in what I believe is a pretty reasonable gray area. And I think outside of the framing issue, there are a couple of tropes that go around that one side dispenses with out of hand, and same thing with the other side. And it seems that on the conservative side, the conservative point of view, or the pro-life point of view more specifically, that's just instantly dispensed with, is the soul. That doesn't seem to be being brought up all that much recently, and I think that's intentional, because the people who talk about this with a large audience seem to recognize that framing it in a religious way is a good way to just get completely ignored, and people don't have to take your argument seriously. On the other side, I think the framework, the trope at the base of it that's easily dispensed with by the right is it's just a clump of cells. I think one of these has validity and the other one doesn't. Obviously, the idea of a soul is complete nonsense. There's no reason to believe that we have souls. That doesn't really impact my point of view on this in any real way. But on the other side, the argument that it's just a clump of cells, that is objectively true up to a certain point. I think the real issue for someone who kind of takes my line of thinking on this, and for the left more generally, but they don't really care about logical consistency at all. But for someone who actually values, being intellectually honest, it is a clump of cells up to a point, and the problem for me is I cannot define where that point is, and it might end up looking like human evolution, where if you took, from every day of human evolution, all of the skulls from a given person, there's not going to be one skull that's, a pre-Homo sapien, and then you have a Homo sapien skull, if I'm even using the correct terminology there. They would look almost indistinguishable from one another all the way down the line. It's just that the insignificant changes would end up looking so drastically different at the end, and that generates the ambiguity there. And I think it's the same situation with a baby, but in the womb, but it's obviously on a very truncated time span, but it's still a long enough time span so that ambiguity causes that issue, and that's the there's one side that plants their flag on this hill, and then there's the other side that plants their flag on this hill. I'm somewhere in the valley in between, probably leaning more right, and I'll explain why. But I don't have a flag planted anywhere. I'm not claiming that I have the answer. I'm not claiming to have an absolute position from which I cannot be moved. But the reality is this: the minute after conception, there is a very insignificant microscopic clump of cells that is not anything yet. And if we know anything, we most certainly know that it's not a being with a conscious experience. And gradually down the line, it goes from a small clump of stem cells to a slightly less small clump of stem cells, and then somewhere up the line. So it's perfectly reasonable a case to make that, say we get into the future and there's some sort of body reading device where right after you have sex you step into the machine and you find out whether or not you're pregnant, and then you are pregnant and you take this pill and you're no longer pregnant. I don't see anything morally wrong with that. You're not ending the conscious experience of someone else. You're not torturing them. You're not harming them in any way. You are in fact just disallowing their existence to begin. And insofar as I don't accept the soul component here, there is no soul. So it's not as though there's a soul that's now been made homeless. That's not. There's no reason to believe that there's anything like that going on either. And then on the other side, the baby who is aborted the moment, the day before birth, or even worse in that case in DC a month ago or 2 months ago, or whenever it was, where it's very likely that some of these babies were killed after they were born. That's clearly wrong. So on one side, on one extreme, there's something that I see absolutely no moral. There's no moral conundrum there. And then on the other end, this is absolutely wrong. There's nothing else to be said about it. You have killed a baby, and I think the reason that the heartbeat bill or the viability issue doesn't really stick with people is because it's entirely arbitrary. It's based on one component of a very, very complicated organism. And if that component that's been chosen arbitrarily does not align with your ideological viewpoint, you just scrap it and say, a heartbeat doesn't mean that this baby's alive, or the fact that it's viable outside the womb with the proper medical gear, that doesn't it doesn't make the sufficient change in the state of the being to change the way that I feel about this issue. So I think that there's important ground here that I suspect has more people standing in it than is believed by one side or the other. But the fact that I don't accept a soul, and the fact that I don't accept that all the way up until the moment of birth, it's a woman's right to choose at some point whether or not they kill their baby, and at some other point you're just stopping the conscious experience of a being before it begins. It's somewhere in the Bible, I believe, and it's quoted in the movie Gangs of New York. But because I'm neither hot nor cold, and I'm lukewarm, I'll be spewing forth, or whatever. So I don't have any allies on this issue because I'm expected to be on one side or the other, and I just don't adopt either viewpoint. So the real issue going on here is the issue of framing, where what I'm talking about is not women's rights or the right for a woman to choose. And also what I'm not talking about is I'm not talking about my concerns for the soul of the child. And at some point along the assembly line, it becomes a child, becomes a being with conscious experience. But here's the thing. I'm not the one who has a problem with where I stand on that. Other people have a problem ideologically and conceptually with my position. I'm not saying with me personally, but everybody seems to have a problem with the position that I hold. And I'm sure that if you hold that position, you would get the same response. But I think there's something there. Those are my thoughts on it. I'm not perfectly convinced on one side or the other. The one note that I would make is that, and this is a really important point, given that I don't know at what point during the pregnancy the lump of cells becomes a being with a conscious experience, given that I don't have an explicit answer on where that point is, I would err on the side of being pro-life, because once you allow at 3 months, then an argument can be made for 4 months, and then 5 months, and then pretty soon you get to the point where you can have an abortion the day before you're due, which is the case, I think, in several states. I couldn't begin to name them, but I think that is the case. I think it's the case here in Colorado. So just my thoughts. All right, thanks.